Good morning. We're getting ready to start. I have to apologize. We're starting 10 minutes late because we're under the state of exception. And if Agamben was here, we could have a very good conversation. We have Amos Nascimento, who will introduce our first speaker.
Good morning. Good morning, buenos días. ¿No? Así que, como que para despertar y empezar con un poquito de energía, ¿no? Since I come from Brazil, I should say bom dia. Yeah, well, it's great to be here. This has been a great conference so far. I thank Alejandro for organizing it and for giving me the opportunity to be part of it. But the greater pleasure for me is to introduce the session. We have, according to the program, of course, and hopefully you have the updated program for this morning. We have a series of papers related to the American Indian, Native American experience in this continent, and its interface with the Latin American perspective, the critical theory, pragmatism, and liberation philosophy. So a series of very interesting papers. But I'll start with Professor Sandy Grande. She's a professor of education at Connecticut College. I was checking on her, and I learned much about the school, which is a kind of a offshoot of Wesleyan University. And it started with a very interesting kind of a tradition. When Wesleyan did not accept women, they decided just to go ahead and start a new branch, would be serving women, and they've been working that tradition since then. Of course, she's the head of the Department of Education, and I also check on the tradition of the department. They have a lot of work done on folks such as Paulo Freire, or se me permiten hablar en portugués, Paulo Freire, also McLaren, and many others, Vindeloria, and she, of course, is very recognized and known for her book on red pedagogy, in which she connects not only her experiences in her native Peru, but also the experience of Native Americans, Indians. We had yesterday, the discussion about what's the best terminology here, but those who experienced the colonial invasion, those who have experienced the oppressed and exclusion of the system for 500 years, not only in Peru, not only in Latin America, but also in other parts of this larger continent we call the Americas. And of course, her presentation is going to be on Indigenous interrogations of neoliberalism, which is, according to many, including to Dussel, yet another wave of this neo-colonial mode. But she'll connect a very interesting topic for us is very contemporary, the occupation of Wall Street, and she's going to be talking about the notes from the other 1%. Without further ado, I'll just pass on to her. I ask you to help me welcome her.
Thank you. Good morning. Buenos dias. Pasmukwe. I'd like to begin by, this seems a little bit far from me. Is that okay? I talk loud? Okay. All right. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's my second trip to Oregon and to this university. It's great to see some old and some new friends. I actually have a friend in the audience that I'm seeing from graduate school, so it's really nice. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our presence in the occupied territories of the indigenous peoples of these lands: the Burns Paiute tribe, Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, Susla, Coquille Indian tribe, Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians, Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Klamath tribes, Confederated tribes of Siletz Indians, Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the Confederated tribes of Warm Springs Reservation. Throughout history, various colonial powers, French, Spanish, British, and Americans have occupied your homelands. I recognize your struggles and stand with you in hope and resistance. I also want to thank the organizers for allowing my presence here, especially Tricia Wickman and Alejandro. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's spoken so far for your words and significant contributions to furthering my own thinking. Thank you. So what follows is a kind of stream of consciousness. I'm glad when I proposed the title, I had the foresight to call them notes. Notes from the other 1%, because that's clearly what they are. But kind of largely unfettered, linked ruminations, connected by the frames and interiors of my subjectivity, Indigenous, American, woman, and the geopolitical space within which it's constituted. For this past week, we have, my family and I, been somewhat homeless, nomadic, itinerant vagabond, the seeming victims of the forces of nature, but ultimately displaced by the havoc of capitalism. For those of you who don't know, there was this freak October nor'easter that went through the Northeast and kind of knocked out, in particular, Connecticut, where my family lives. In the aftermath of the freak October nor'easter, the state literally went dark. At its peak, an estimated 2 million homes across the Northeast lost power, with close to over 1 million in Connecticut alone. The outages were so widespread that for miles on end there was no food, no gas, no hotel rooms, no wired or wireless communications. In one fell swoop, the myths of capital, diversification, and proliferation were laid bare. The state's predicament was greatly exacerbated by the fact that one company, Connecticut Light and Power, serviced nearly 80% of its residents. Additionally, customers who, quote, packaged their phone, cable, and computer services, were pressured by corporate consolidations of power, were left at the mercy of one other company, Cox Cable. As if there were any doubt before, corporations are clearly not persons. As a person, I am the primary caretaker of my 80-year-old parents, plus. Despite the fact that they have both good insurance and pensions, home health care and assistance remains financially out of reach. Almost every day, something happens that reminds me of the thin line, essentially me, that stands between them and a life of destitution. For example, if I hadn't been home the night of the storm, they would have been left in the dark, the cold, and the uncertainty. As it was, we drove from under-resourced shelter, then to hotel rooms 45 minutes away, and eventually out of state. All the transfer and movement inevitably led to another fall for my mom, who was already weak from a previous injury. She literally buckled under the stress. So in the middle of everything, we spent a 12-hour day in an understaffed, overwhelmed emergency room in a private hospital, a so-called quality of care experience that actually situates us among the privileged class in the U.S. At some point, I realized that the crisis isn't theirs. That is, I noticed the relative ease, if not comfort, my parents seem to embody as those around them struggle to live with less. They are resourceful and even-spirited, as if they understand that the moment is not simply one of loss and destruction, but rather a rebalancing and restoration of nature's power over man's. Their brown weathered bodies mark the colonial difference as they stand against the white of the snow-covered ground. In the winter of 2009, a collaborative of Native scholars, artists, activists, and community leaders assembled to discuss the possibility of creating an Indigenous think tank. We gathered in Lower Manhattan, in the bowels of the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Customs House, plotting political subversion and intellectual infiltration into the teeming world above, Wall Street. Certainly then, but especially now, the deep ironies of this scene are both cogent and palpable. Consider, for example, the U.S. Customs House is situated betwixt Battery Park, the site of Fort Amsterdam where Dutch invaders bivouacked to protect their conquests, and Wall Street, the heart of darkness in the recent fall of empire. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of State and is credited not only with shaping American capitalism, but also Wall Street. The Department of Treasury was founded on September 11th, 1789. As treasurer, Hamilton inherited a bankrupt nation, struggling under the debt incurred from financing war. At the time, the, quote, customs revenue was largely generated through trade with American Indians, helping to finance most of the major land, quote, acquisitions, read confiscations, and expeditions, read invasions, into Indian country. In 1973, the Customs House was relocated to the World Trade Center. In 1994, the National Museum of the American Indian opened at the site of the old Customs House that was now renamed in honor of Alexander Hamilton. On September 11th, 2001, the new U.S. Customs House, located at 6 World Trade Center, was obliterated 212 years later to the day that the Department of Treasury was founded. And so there we were, there we gathered, descendants of the quote-unquote savage, for the promise of intellectualism and social change, while the supposed architecture of civilization lay in ruins in the streets above, a victim of its own barbarism. Contrary to the dominant discourse, the seeds of its ruin long precede Bernie Madoff, Goldman Sachs, Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman, and the neoliberal turn. Rather, the fall from grace commenced over 500 years ago, beginning with genocide and the first occupation of Wall Street. Around this time, when Alexander Hamilton was serving as treasurer, he was already being extolled as the father of American capitalism. Fittingly, his tenure was just as fraught with corruption and controversy, full of suspect windfalls, extortion, nepotism, and insider trading, as Hank Paulson's Treasury Secretary under George Bush. Foreign capital and corruptive men were said to be in constant motion around Hamilton, who was involved in so many specious dealings, including a $2,000 payment to a government agent to, quote, hurry the Seneca into signing away their rights to millions of acres of land. It's no wonder he met his untimely death in a duel with a fellow political. Perhaps the central irony of these early days of Wall Street is the zealous fervor with which the colonizers sought to eradicate the contagion of Indianness, viewing savagery as the potential cancer poised to destroy the moral purity of the new nation. Thus, what began as an atomized missionary venture centered on conversion to both Christianity and capitalism eventually burgeoned into a centralized, federalized project whereby the edicts of Christianity were mapped onto the hegemonic principles of modernity, arguably giving capital even more eviscery power. Unlike the event of genocide, Wolff explains that the logic of elimination refers not only to the summary liquidation of indigenous peoples, but also to the erection of a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. This elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial society, rather than a one-off and superseded occurrence. This underscores that the primary motive for elimination is not race or religion, ethnicity, grade of civilization, etc., but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. In other words, the appropriation, thievery, and occupation of land, i.e. dispossession, is a central feature of colonization, past and present. I live less than 10 miles from Zuccotti Park. That small public space, currently occupied by the OWS protesters, is actually privately owned by Brookfield Properties, a transnational real estate company. It acquired the park in 2006, made some significant renovations, and then renamed it after its CEO, John Zuccotti. Prior to then, the area was known as Liberty Plaza Park, established in 1968 by United States Steel, one of the original Wall Street conglomerates, founded in 1901 by J.P. Morgan. Before that, the area passed through the successive hands of empire. Treaties in the colonial era began with American Indian and European nations. Treaties in the colonial era between American Indian and European nations were premised on indigenous sovereignty. The caveat, however, was that dominion over territory was held to inhere in the European sovereign, in whose name it had been, quote, discovered. This distinction between dominion and occupancy reveals settler colonialism's reliance on the elimination of native society. As Wolfe cogently explains, through being the first European to visit and properly claim a given territory, a discoverer acquired the right on behalf of his sovereign and vis-a-vis other Europeans who came after him to buy land from the natives. This right, known as preemption, gave the discovering power a monopoly over land transactions with the natives, who are preventing from disposing of their land to any other European power. On the face of it, this would seem to pose little threat to people who did not wish to dispose of their land to anyone. In practice, however, the corollary did not apply. Preemption sanctioned European priority, but not indigenous freedom of choice. As Harvey Rosenthal observed, of the concept's extension into the U.S. constitutional environment, the American right to buy always superseded the Indian right not to sell. As such politics play out in the geopolitical space of Lower Manhattan, the Dutch were first in line to buy the land from the Lenape. This, quote, sale was legitimated by the mythic $24 worth of trinkets and beads narrative. But cognizant of their theory, the Dutch built an actual wall around its bounty, protecting it from future interlopers, hence the name Wall Street. Eventually, they lost the spoils of war to the British, who then ceded it to the Americans in 1783. The territory has thus been effectively occupied for 519 years. Its current worth is estimated at $911 per square foot, and the average residential property selling for over $1.2 million. Since 2001, the U.S. has spent over $1.2 trillion financing war. According to the last U.S. Census, the median income of American Indian peoples in the United States is estimated at $33,000 a year. This year marks the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and you can almost see Ground Zero from Zuccotti Park. Once the site of mass devastation, the Freedom Tower now looms in the background. The memorial features the 2,983 names of the victims of 9/11. Literally etched in stone, they will never be forgotten. At the same time, the edifices of the financial district, the Freedom Tower, Zuccotti Park, the Alexander Hamilton House, all in one way or another stand as monuments to American empire, erected upon the bloody soils of other foreign invasions. Yet there are no names of the thousands of men, women, and children of the Lenape present anywhere in Lower Manhattan, in Manhattan. Instead, the place/geopolitical space is saturated with the logic of elimination. Still, over 70,000 Native Americans from over 75 different tribes currently reoccupy New York City. We shall remain. In his book, No Name in the Street, James Baldwin writes, "Force does not work the way its advocates seem to think it does. It does not, for example, reveal to the victim the strength of his adversary. On the contrary, it reveals the weakness, even the panic of his adversary, and this revelation invests the victim with patience. Furthermore, it is ultimately fatal to create too many victims. The victor can do nothing with these victims, for they do not belong to him, but to the victims. They belong to the people he is fighting. The people know this, and as inexorably as the roll call, the honor roll of victims expands, so does their will become inexorable. They resolve that these dead, their brethren, shall not have died in vain. When this point is reached, however, long the battle may go on. The victor can never be the victor. On the contrary, all his energies, his entire life, are bound up in a terror he cannot articulate, a mystery he cannot read, a battle he cannot win. He has simply become the prisoner of the people he thought to cow, chain, or murder into submission. The excluded begin to realize, having endured everything, that they can endure everything. They do not know the precise shape of the future, but they know that the future belongs to them." The OWS activists have clearly constructed themselves as victims of corporate greed, big government, environmental destruction, liberal and conservative dogmas, capitalism, injustice, etc. They erect signs like, Wall Street is our street. Let's take our country back. And number 1 on their official statement of grievances, the OWS General Assembly lists, they have taken our homes through illegal foreclosure processes, despite not having the original mortgage. Within such discourse, there's little recognition of the ways in which their enunciations reenact the grammar of empire, a discourse premised on the expansion of modernity and Western capitalism, but divorced from any analysis of the colonial difference as articulated by Mignolo. In this sense, OWS is a site of reproduction, subject to the intellectual hegemony of the geopolitical and pedagogical spaces within which it arose. Consider, for example, that while the phrase American Empire elicits over 1 million hits on Google, almost 9,000 book titles on Amazon, and nearly 4,000 articles in the New York Times, the phrase settler colonialism fetters only 55 hits. Kaplan writes, across the political spectrum, policymakers, journalists, and academics are talking endlessly about empire. It's fashionable, in fact, to debate whether this is a new imperialism or business as usual, whether the United States should be properly called imperial or hegemonic, whether it's benevolent or self-interested, whether it should rely on hard power or self-power, whether this empire closely resembles the British Empire or the Roman, and whether it's an ascendancy or a decline. All the deliberations have given rise to an economic boom in scholarship that theorizes the so-called new configurations of empire. Yet, as the works of Mignolo, Dussel, and Quijano suggest, analyses of empire that emanate from the imperial center impose a kind of intellectual imperialism on the study of colonialism. Though marginalized, there are indeed scholars who write from the edges of empire, indigenous scholars. Alfred Barr, Corntassel, Coulthard, Keone, Kent Simpson, Stuart Hayawida, among others. All reject the notion that the current formations of U.S. hegemony constitute anything new or even rising. Rather, they simply evidence a deepening, hastening, and stretching of an already existing imperial power. At the heart of my work, too, is the insistence that the Indian question is not simply relevant to contemporary theorizations of power, or more accurately, the coloniality of power, but actually the central intervention or loci of enunciation. Without disruption of what Kassanjian refers to as the colonizing trick, the myth that the U.S. was founded on democratic principles eroded through the practices of slavery and genocide, as opposed to fundamentally constituted by them, we will suffer the fate of the victor, as articulated by Baldwin. As such, I affirm settler colonialism and its reliance on the logic of elimination to access territory, dispossession, as the defining strategy of the colonial state and the capitalism inherent to it. This shift is intended to underscore both the materiality of conquest as well as the enduring significance of land, place, and space to the neoliberal order. As an educator, a teacher, I also work to understand the implications of this question on spaces of learning, indeed to bring ethics to bear on processes of education, and to specifically articulate a pedagogy of the dispossessed. I see this work as part of a broader political project that aims to make the pedagogical more politically informed and the political more pedagogically critical. That is, I seek to identify political/pedagogical strategies that go beyond simply resisting the coloniality of power and work instead to interrogate the epistemological underpinnings of which this world order was conceived. I'm especially interested in the processes by which relations of mutuality are eroded by capitalism. My recent post-storm experiences, whereby the relations of mutuality embodied in the parent-child, neighbor-neighbor, doctor-patient, and even state-citizen, were indeed consciously and recklessly abandoned by capital, have only fueled my passions. I write with even greater urgency as the latest remix of colonization sacrifices more bodies and souls. While my project draws from multiple theories, it ultimately centers the critical indigenous theory, a red pedagogy, that seeks to make, reoccupy, and persist rather than explain or account for the vicissitudes of empire. Indigenous critical theory intervenes in something rather than explains something, not because it is located within the existing aporias of law and justice, but because it lies in a particular spacing that is at once both inside and outside of it. While my work in Red Pedagogy offers a preliminary framework for understanding how conceptions of citizenship, democracy, nation, tribe, sovereignty, self-determination, and education are not only mediated but also co-constituted within the frames of settler colonialism, in my current work I write more explicitly about the need to move beyond political and pedagogical paradigms centered on abstract, decontextualized notions of social justice or democracy, and instead activate an explicitly decolonial project that refuses displacement and dispossession. As such, the pedagogical imperative of my work is to define ways in which schools and communities can be reimagined, or more specifically, re-territorialized to occupy more sovereign socio-political places, not only open to the renegotiation of capitalist relations, but also to the redefinition of alternative ways of being. From here, I outline three sort of ways of thinking of moving forward. The first is reframing. Reframing the discourse. And these shifts are sort of on balance, right? So on balance, shifting the discourse from oppression to dispossession, from talking about colonization to the politics of elimination, from neoliberalism / capitalism to settler colonialism, and from liberation to decolonization. I believe that such discursive moves provide relief from the politics and pedagogies of crisis. That is, when colonization is bracketed to this 19th century project, it compels a renaming, a rebranding of its contemporary eruptions as something new, which I think then limits the possibility of generational and collective consciousness. And I find that to be very deliberate. And so we're left with these problematic partial and oppositional discourses like that taken up by OWS that ultimately only reenact the logic of elimination. This is not to suggest a flattening of the distinctions among analytic concepts and frameworks, such as globalization, neoliberalism, etc., but rather to suggest that the frame of settler colonialism illuminates the common social character of what prima facie appears to be distinct socioeconomic processes. Second is building coalitions and solidarities. The understanding of colonization as an ever-expanding, metastasizing project that only captures more and more communities within its tentacles, I believe, creates greater possibilities for coalition. For example, it allows us to consider that what is happening in to the brown, black, and poor cities across the nation, to workers in Detroit, to public school children in Newark, New Jersey, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., etc., is not simply about race, class, employment, outsourcing, downsizing, privatization. Rather, it's a removal, a dispossession exacted by an elite class still intent on their visions of manifest destiny. Third is trying to kind of think through what's the role of Indigenous scholars in this project. Given that Indigenous knowledge is critical to the health and well-being of our planet, not because it holds any magic or ancient wisdom, but because it represents a competing moral vision to the dominant patterns of thinking and being, it's incumbent upon us to protect the complex ecologies that sustain Indigenous knowledge, to create and sustain the conditions under which such knowledge can survive and thrive. Thus, rather than define a project whereby Indigenous scholars are tasked with interjecting Indigenous knowledge into the fold, I argue alongside Indigenous philosopher Dale Turner that we leave Indigenous knowledges where they belong, in our communities. Instead, Turner calls for us to take on the role of word warriors. Specifically, as Indigenous scholars educated in the white man's ways of thinking and the white man's intellectual discourses, it's our duty to participate in the dominant intellectual life, gaining greater access to the practices and institutions of the legal and political institutions where rights are mediated. Our primary function within these venues is to defend our communities, speak back to and disrupt the coloniality of power, to engage social transformation from the inside out. Serving as allies in this scenario are non-Indigenous scholars who are also committed to the life of public intellectualism, who engage social transformation from the outside in, who not only work with and alongside Indigenous peoples, but also advocate for white stream transformation, particularly of their own institutions, organizations, political systems, and intellectual projects. Perhaps most importantly, it means standing with us to contain coloniality, the coloniality of power that envelops the globe. Such solidarities are beginning to emerge even within the broader OWS movement. For example, the 99% of Occupy Boston issued a resolution, a memorandum of solidarity with Indigenous peoples. It reads, whereas those participating in Occupy Boston acknowledge that the United States of America is a colonial country and that we are guests upon stolen Indigenous land that has already been occupied for centuries, Boston being the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. And whereas members of the First Nations have continued to resist the violent oppression and exploitation of the colonizers since they first arrived on this continent, and as a result have a great amount of experience that could strengthen this movement. And whereas after centuries of disregard for the welfare of future generations and the consistent disrespect and exploitation of the earth, we find ourselves on a polluted and disturbed planet, lacking the wisdom to live sustainably at peace with the community of life. Therefore, be it resolved that we seek the involvement of the First Nations in the rebuilding of a new society on their ancestral land. And as a signal to the national Occupy movement and to members of First Nations who have felt excluded by the colonialist language used to name this movement, it shall be declared that Occupy Boston aspires to decolonize Boston with the guidance and participation of First Nations peoples. So not perfect, there's some stuff in there I might change around, but a beginning. Together, I believe, indeed, we need to wage a Gramscian war position with the goal of building a counter-hegemonic decolonial solidarity. We need to see ourselves in the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, the Quechua in Peru, the Maori in Aotearoa, the Mohawks in New York and Canada, and other indigenous movements in Chile, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Now is the time for all of us to take up this mantle and share the work of word warriors. I think we owe it to our respective communities to take our places on the front line, to be the voices in between, to claim the margin as a perimeter of empowerment and a space from which to launch the first salvos. I hope to see you along the red road of redemption.
So we have time for some questions.
Thank you for your paper. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the relation between communities and lands, because obviously there's a kind of metaphorical notion of dispossession, and there's also a kind of concrete notion of dispossession. I'm interested in the concrete notion a bit, especially given sort of the fact that people have moved around and so forth, and there's distance now between communities and their traditional lands and so on. How do you see that working in this process of decolonization?
You mean lands of tribal peoples?
I mean, in particular lands of tribal peoples, but also then what the implication is for those people who don't have a relation with tribal lands.
Yeah, sure, because, I mean, that is the history of dispossession and decolonization. Yeah. I guess I can speak, and I often like to speak in terms of my own reference point and community, but so I think even when people, so there's like, again, 70,000 Native folks living in New York City who, at first glance, you would say they don't have any connection to their lands. But by and large, they would never say that. I mean, they kind of very familiar with this kind of migratory existence that they have between home and where they are. And in fact, in many languages, and certainly in Quechua, there's a lot of words to kind of talk about. You talk about yourself almost in relation to the distance that you are from home. So you might call yourself one thing when you're there, when you're a little bit far, and then when you're really far. So you're always home, it just depends on how far away you are, is how we read. So I think that relationship is kind of integral to how most folks define it, which isn't to say, somebody might make that choice to be disconnected. And I see as part of my work, even if somebody might, and I think a lot of us do, is even if you might not be in that literal space, to take on the intellectual project and the moral project, the ethical project, to fetter both encroachment and to work there to kind of protect, I'm uneasy with that word, but way of being so long as folks there continue to choose that way of being.
Could I ask a follow-up? In the context of pedagogy then, this effort of decolonization, do you see it as actually including a component that is about sort of land learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So even with my student teachers who come in, I always say to them, you can't devise any curriculum, math, science, whatever it is, without first doing investigation of where you are. Where are your students? What's the history of that land? How can you connect what you're talking about to them to literally to the land or kind of to those communities historically? And at first they're like, not too happy about it. It takes a lot of work. But then, when they see to the degree, and then they kind of make their curricula and they think, okay, this is kind of interesting. But the students are going to want to talk about it. And once they finally see, it's interesting to see the reaction from students who I think deep down somewhere we all hunger for that connection. What does it mean for us to be here, whether it's, Pine Ridge or Lakewood, Ohio, or East Harlem? They want to know. They want to feel connected to that place.
Yes. I'll actually take... I'm sorry. I'll ask a question rather than calling on someone. I'm feeling a little guilty. Sorry. My question is this. The discussion of occupation, the way you are phrasing it, it's in terms of the colonial difference. And the way I see the colonial difference is as a double movement, a recognition of structures of power. But I took that what Walter Mignolo is doing is doing an inversion of that doesn't keep that relationship anymore, keeps it to light, but this is only one moment. And the other moment is a moment of possible encounters in which the very claim to being colonizer, it's undone. I would say it's deconstructed, actually. It just disseminates. So my question is about this dissemination and the possibilities that are opened by this dissemination. And this question comes out of the fact that you speak about, you were speaking about occupation, and there's this long history of occupation and disenfranchisement and displacement. But there is also the occupation of Wall Street, which is related to the colonizer in a strange way. And it's this way, that the movement of occupation doesn't begin in the United States. It begins in May in Spain. And the people that occupy in the squares in Spain and in Italy and all these places were colonizers in many ways, right? So they're disenfranchised colonizers. And then, furthermore, the occupations in Chile are done by the 4 months of strikes of students. Those students are not colonizers or indigenous, but they're actually occupying, I think, the colonial difference in their bodies by the fact that they cannot take side on one side or the other. So they cannot decide to be native and to have that kind of relationship. So I'm wondering how you're conceiving a possible relationship between colonizers and indigenous at that side of the colonial difference. There is a positive side of the dissemination and encounters.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's the global kind of occupy. There's completely different situations. So thinking a little bit more specifically about the folks in Wall Street, who by and large are also, the colonizer. It's getting more and more diverse, but certainly not initially. And I think that notion of the colonial depth is exactly what you say. It kind of opens that space of both kind of helping you to kind of see what the complex relationships are. So I would agree with you. I think in this particular, the way the students are using and engaging that kind of language and discourse, I find problematic if they're not making that connection, at least not even thinking about the place or the loci of their own enunciation. They're not even thinking about it. They're just kind of in this one particular moment. So that's what I was trying to urge, perhaps maybe not as clearly as I wanted to, but yeah.
I think Elizabeth would first.
Where do you want to?
Well, I'm trying to go in order.
Okay, in order.
Otherwise,
All
I
right.
get confused.
I create problems with that. But, well, thank you for that paper. I really enjoyed it because it's so often absent, those sorts of issues from our discussions. I just had two questions and for you, because I was struck by what you were saying at the beginning about the monuments to the American empire that are built up. And being in Chicago, I'm always struck by the fact that when I take students to try to, there's a whole curriculum there about exploring Chicago, and I always try to make connections to the native past, and it's very hard. We have the Bowman and the Spear, which was done by a Croatian artist, and then in the Marquette building, beautiful mosaics of Marquette's encounters with the natives, but really there's no trace of any indigenous or Indian past at all in Chicago. So that leads me to think that monuments might be linked into this sort of pedagogical point that you were making too, that we have an obligation as a society to make people aware of that presence which has been stripped. So that I would be interested in hearing what you think about that point of sort of taking monumental presences seriously, because it's really disappointing that they're just erased from, that past is erased completely from so many cities. And people in Chicago know the meaning, the word Chicago comes from a Native American word, but that's all they know. And then I just would also be interested in hearing more about this point you made about reframing the discourse from oppression to dispossession, because obviously the two are related, and how do you see those two then as related in this kind of move to reframe the discourse?
Yeah, I mean, even myself, when I first moved to Manhattan, so things are rendered invisible, but but they're still there in a way. I mean, sort of like that incompleteness of the project of elimination. So, and I think, again, it's critically important to kind of, incumbent upon all of us to figure out what are those connections. So even in New York, when it's not like these huge monuments, like Broadway is the longest Indian trail in the nation. It's just now Broadway and paved over, right? But the ingenuity of the folks when they made it to get, and where it wanders closer to ports and farther away, engineers would have a hard time mapping that out now, right? And in Upper Manhattan, where I used to live, was also another park and a space where, Native folks took the high ground, literally, took the high ground. So you can, at least for me, I think you can find a lot of connections there. And I think that's possible anywhere. Chicago was a relocation city for Native folks, so there's like a really interesting Native diasporic population in Chicago that really kind of takes that work on. And the second part of the question was oppression to dispossession. I mean, to me, dispossession just kind of marks that very spatial, quality in a way that oppression doesn't, to me, at least not at first glance. That we're talking about, space, land at some level. It's a very much more seems of a geopolitical construct than, a little bit more fundamentally temporal than oppression might be.
Oh, okay.
We have a question here out front.
Yes, I'd also like to thank you for your talk, and I'd like to get back to the area of education departments. And it seems to me in the United States, most education departments are focused on K through 12 education, forgetting other areas and spaces of education and learning, as Paulo Freire, of course, showed us. And the main discourse today is the United States is falling behind. Our kids are not doing as well on standardized tests as kids in other parts of the world. And so this obviously has imperialistic overtones to it, which is very strong within the education department. And I really admire how you are able to bring up these other concerns, and I'd like to know a little bit about how that works within the education department, and how you're able to hold your ground, so to speak.
Literally. Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate to be in a department that I think recognizes the work as important, and our own conceptual framework is kind of deployed around critical theory, which is really nice. And so we talk explicitly, and in the first class, the big part of the learning outcome measurable goal is learning, the grammar of Empire in a Way as a grammar, and they literally have to, and then learn critical theory and how to engage critique, to talk about hegemony, legitimation, forces of social reproduction, cultural reproduction. I mean, that's really their first class, is to, and then from there, what we hope is it initiates a particular consciousness, so that when they're digesting things that seem decontextualized, like do this math exam, that they have this in the back of their head of, what is the approach to knowledge in this fundamentally decontextualized, linear, hierarchical way? What am I doing? And they think that those questions don't resonate in their head, but by the time they're seniors, most of them think, I had one student come in and she's like, Professor Grande, I'm so mad at you. And I said, why? What happened? She said, because I can't think anymore without thinking about all this other stuff. And I said, well, I think that's a good thing. But they really, they struggle with it at first, but then, and it's not a perfect system, but I mean, that's at least how we try. Yeah.
Charles?
Two short questions. First, this is just a question of curiosity. Do you teach strictly in English? And then the second question is, I would be very interested in hearing you speak a little bit more about the experience of dislocation. I'm, in my mind, without any particular justification, I'm seeing or feeling a difference between land and earth, and simple space, real estate, and connection with the earth. And I'm curious to know how you think of those things.
Sure, absolutely. The first question was... I teach in a teacher education program at a small liberal arts college, where our curriculums, to your point, are almost scripted now. So, I teach in English. So while I see connections between, dispossession from property as opposed to dispossession from... land isn't even quite right.
Excuse me, I'm drawing a distinction between dispossession and disconnection.
Disconnection, okay. You're trying to understand that.
The disconnection experience, yeah.
Okay.
Vis-a-vis land and earth.
Okay. I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but I think that, I guess to some degree, so land to me, depending on the context in which it's used, signifies you might be talking about property, right? And earth is something, I was trying to think about this actually just before that, in Quechua you would say Pachamama, which often gets translated to Mother Earth, but there's a lot of ways in which that doesn't quite get it, because it's a little bit more Earth as Mother. I don't know. Something about that is just, it's still like Mother Earth still seems like this kind of object or something, I don't know. So it doesn't quite capture. And I think, there's a lot of words or ways which I think the issue of language is central to a lot of this. When you struggle in English to find, I think somebody yesterday was saying, is it justice? When we had this conversation, is it justice, is it mercy, is it this? And it's like everything is always disconnected, certainly in English. And so in other languages, a lot of times you wouldn't even have that struggle because it's already recognized as being one and the same.
Could I follow up just a moment? My own experience coming from a rural background more, and that's what I'm speaking out of and asking a question out of. When I'm in Manhattan, I'm not close to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of real estate, and you could call it land. But that's an experience, not
Mm-hmm.
just a
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-Saxon distinction, I think. And connection to the earth strikes me, you know more about this than I do, that connection with the earth seems to be profoundly important within the Native American tribes almost across the board as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've got children who have Native American backgrounds, who lived all their lives in cities. And you said that one of the tasks, which I was admiring, you want to bring all disciplines into a certain sense of where they are and how they're situated and who they are,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, in that context, is the experience, the contact with Earth, as it oftentimes is expressed in various
Mm-hmm.
lore and rhythms, is that just gone?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'll speak for myself, but no, absolutely not. And I guess, for me, it's not so contingent on location, so I still feel my connection, whether I'm in Eugene, Oregon, or Manhattan. It's a much deeper connection than that. That's kind of just in your body, in your actual body, in your ancestral body. And I think, I remember even reading some research that kids with often the most troubling disconnection, if you want to think about that way, to Earth were kids who lived on farms because it was a very utilitarian relationship that they forged. Whereas kids like in New York, might have this other kind of value because in their head they feel like they don't have access to it. So I think it's, depends on how you think about or how you construct that relationship for yourself of I don't think that it disappears. I think it will disappear first, maybe. But
Eduardo?
Oh, me. What a wonderful paper. Thank you so much. I was really moved and very much inspired by the paper. And in the first part, what I saw working was an opposition between an archaeology of dispossession by going and digging through the history of dispossession in Manhattan, in standing over against a geography of empire. And one is the memory of dispossession, and the other one is a geography of oblivion. And I was very interested in your reference to the 9/11 memorial, and I wanted to see if you could expand on it, because I just find that the whole memorial is really a fascinating exercise in imperial hubris, in which the whole site, which is hugely expensive, hugely disruptive, it's just one huge monument to empire. And I wanted to hear more on that.
yeah, we share. I mean, certainly no disrespect to the families and to the folks that suffered there, and absolutely indeed for anybody who lives in New York, it's that day and the memory of that day is stunning. So that being said, I would agree with you. I mean, there was something when you would go by there and it was just a hole in the ground, which doesn't exist. Certainly not in Lower Manhattan, but anywhere. But in that, where it's like so dense, just this enormous hole, was so much more powerful for me than to now drive by and it's this slick, Freedom Tower and the discourse around it, I think, has indeed reenacted, the way they've talked about it, to a large degree. I think just, again, kind of reenacts that imperialistic kind of jingoistic. And it's also, it's just such an odd, this whole space, and I haven't been able to spend all that much time because I've been trekking around my parents, but it's so interesting to just, be there. It was so present in my mind, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to just begin my weaving, and that's why it was the stream of consciousness, but to kind of think about all those places that are right there. So the Native American Museum, it's right next to Zuccotti Park, which you can see the Freedom Tower there. I mean, it's all, and then you see the, predominantly white kids, but increasingly mixed, like protesting. I mean, there's just something about being there that just, it's an amazing pedagogical space to just try to think about.
Nelson.
Well, a few points, beginning with I think that in a way you hit the nail on its head in doing two things. First off, in a way, challenging the rhetorical power or adequacy of even the notion of the 99%, right? That as a mobilizing cry that, of course, is calling attention to a wide majority of people who are excluded, who are suffering from a system of exploitation and accumulation. But at the same time, you run the risk of homogenizing that 99% and the kind of the ways in which they have been affected by capital, and then even larger than capital by, let's say, colonialist possession, settler colonialism, and so on. So I typically find myself more and more, I mean, I did it before, but I continue doing it in a way. You need to bring up, right, the difference between the top 10%, the below 10%, the top one, the lowest one, and so on, to disrupt that kind of narrative. And what is interesting is that in a way, the shift to 99% and part of its power is like, well, you have to be concerned because you most likely are part of that 99, right? Because it's 99 after all. But what is it that we cannot be compelled to listen to the cry, to the situation of that lower 10 or 5 or 1%, that because we do not necessarily belong to them, that makes their cry, less powerful or less relevant? So there is much in the sense of pedagogical intervention, I think, to make there. But also, of course, in the very concept of occupying, right, the very sort of imperial undertones, colonizing undertones of that. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, the quite easy disconnection that there could be between occupied and the difference that there is between occupy and decolonize. And decolonize being, in a way, a more ancient discourse, particularly from the bottom 10, 5, and 1%, right? So what does it mean when you take this and at the same time there is not an effective linkage between these and even a reflection about even whether occupy is what should be at the forefront. This the occupy everything, sort of mindset and ideology and sort of philosophical framework has been emerging a number of years now. And at Berkeley, before Occupy Wall Street, I was teaching at Berkeley a few years ago and participating actively in a lot of the organizing on campus. And there was one branch of the movement that was set up on occupying everything, occupying buildings, occupying everything, right? The idea is that you occupy, you interrupt the normal functions because the normal functions have become now abnormal, right? So you interrupt that normality that is setting itself up as the norm, and then you, in a way, you allow capital and the structure to work as they work, which is through violence and police, and reveal their actual makeup. So it was a very interesting movement, sort of semi-messianic, heroic somehow. They come to the scene, and because they get people rallying around the occupation, so that means that this is, and whoever is not occupying is not actually quite radical enough. It was very interesting. This is before Spain. There was like 2 years in campuses in California, happened in Santa Cruz, at Berkeley. And actually, I ended up that year with a number of students of color doing, trying to reach, trying to connect, and at the end, it was so difficult. Actually, what happened was, when you open the door for the dialogue, they will begin to recognize, oh yes, people of color and the lower folks, and they would go to those spaces, and it was very, very interesting because in a way they began to occupy those spaces, like multicultural center, and they would go there rhetorically because they are going to work with you, but ultimately they will continue to do the same kind of planning in the places that were the residues that people of color had. So it's very, I mean, I'm saying that because you're facing the challenge of being a warrior, a war warrior, and how to go about that. But what is interesting is that this week at Berkeley, there was another march trying to occupy the lawn in front of the main building of the administration of Berkeley. It made the administrations and the police, it made national news. Now they're calling for a strike. There is a lot of mobilization. I'm still getting the messages from several lists from Berkeley. And in the last 3 days, I received like 200 messages. People, it was quiet for a year and a half. Suddenly, it's exploding. But because they're trying to occupy. Again, now with the reference to Wall Street. But what is interesting to me is that there is, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Berkeley is located, already a very significant and powerful, let's say, in the past memory of occupation. And it was the occupation of Alcatraz, right? And then you begin to think, I mean, just think about that, the occupation by native peoples of Alcatraz back in the late 60s, and occupation of these parts, and Oakland, for instance, that is there now.
Right.
And think about, you know, the difference, because one was, I think, very consciously strategy of occupation within the framework of decolonization. And the other was not necessarily so. And it's interesting that it's happening right there in Alcatraz, in the Bay, right? But somehow the occupiers, it's never been a major reference at all, before in the occupations of last 2 years, or even now. So there is a radical disconnect between these. So you see, you're calling for these being warriors and so on. I'm just really curious to see what ways do you think that are most effective to do this, or, you know, at the end when you try, then you realize, well, our option at Berkeley was, well, we just need to make sure if we leave decolonization as an ethico-political imperative, being something that we have to wait for them to adopt, we will die probably before we do it. So we just go out and do our own activities and do it, always welcoming. But so how do you go about, or what is your experience with that?
Yeah. Wow, some excellent points. I should have been taking notes. Yeah, I mean, all those, I mean, on the one hand, I do see part of my work as doing the articulations you just did. What are the connections? And making them explicit, because they're made to be, they're rendered, you know, invisible in the dominant discourses. So kind of to do that intellectual work to make those connections. And then it's always that push and pull. Do you do that work, or do you just, as you said, you know, if we keep doing that, it's never gonna, you know, we need to do, kind of be engaged in our own struggles and concentrate there, because there's so many and so constant. And I guess, you know, to me, hopefully it's a both and kind of recognizing what your role and what your kind of, you know, tribal life to a large degree was all about, doing the thing that you know, were meant to do, kind of embodying that. What is your kind of strength? What is your role, contribution to the overall project? Not that everybody should embody all the pieces of the project all at once, right? So, you know, and I think what Turner is asking for is like those of us that have had this precise, exact privileged experience of being in the academy, that it's our job to do that translation, to do that, to be that voice in between. And then to support the folks who are doing, you know, the occupying, right? The work, they have another different kind of capital within the community or whatever, that everybody has, you know, kind of embodies the space that they were led to do, meant to do, and kind of do the work of figuring out what can my kind of, you know, most significant point of entryway be into this, and then obviously build coalition. So I don't know if that answers your question.
We have time for one last question. Omar.
Hi, thank you for your paper. Very quickly, I'm wondering about it's kind of what Charles was thinking about, I think, but from a Quechua perspective, from an Indian perspective, and what the idea of property of land is really not part of that tradition. And so I was wondering if even the concept of occupation and territory resonates with that lineage. And I'm not saying what I find interesting is to think about the hybrid character of our thought, in which we are trying to energize indigenous lineages, but we are also participating in languages and conceptualities that might not necessarily resonate with indigenous modes of thought. And I was wondering, what I love about your work is it's so situated and takes on these issues. So I was wondering just about that point. The resistance and the conceptuality of resistance is articulated in a way that might not be necessarily linked, or kind of hybrid, I don't know how to call it, space, to indigenous lineages.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So to the issue of land in particular?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the very concept of occupation, and I'm trying to think of how are we thinking about occupation? You know, and I think that concept does a lot of work. So that's the concept of territory. Right. But at the same time, I'm wondering, but from an indigenous perspective that we want to definitely remain linked with, you know, how, from that point of view, how does this concept of territory and occupation fit into a notion of earth and so forth that Charles?
Yeah. I mean, I think you can be connected to a relation, which ultimately land would be, right? A relation rather than a thing, a space, just a geopolitical space you occupy. And like going back to the, you know, to Lenape and kind of trying to unpack that whole narrative that got constructed around selling it for $24 or whatever. You know, at least the, you know, the indication is that they not having a concept that this was something that they were selling, but rather kind of, you know, you want to pass through? Okay, we'll take that toll. So, you know, I think, I don't know why this is back, but
move the microphone, because there is a kind of echo. An echo.
So to fundamentally perceive it as perceive it as a relation. I think it stopped now. Yeah. Oh, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So land, anyway, land as a relation, I think, is fundamentally different than, land as something to occupy.
No. Oh, there we go. Hello. So thank you very much, Sandy. Please join me in thanking her. So we have a 10-minute break. Thank you very much.